I'm Levin, and I've been developing my action roguelike game, MythoMania, for 100 days now. In the game, you pissed off every god from every mythology, and so they're sending armies to take you down. So you fight off waves, level up, and stack items in order to create unique synergies and take the fight to the gods. The game has already come a long ways in the last 75 days. Over the first 25 days, I set out the foundations of the combat and items for the game. And then over the 26th to 50th day, I started fleshing out the game with content like enemies and items, and I also added the first boss fight with Ares, the Greek god of war. And in the previous video, I covered up to the 75th day, at which point I've added player upgrades, menus, and familiars who evolve like Pokemon as you stack items. So in this video, I'm going to get my game to the point that I can make a Steam page for it and actually begin doing some demoing. So that means that I need a complete game loop, a decent amount of content, and a big art overhaul because frankly the game is kind of an eyesore. So let's start. So I started off on day 76 by making some sprites for items. A lot of the items in the game have hastily put together pixel art icons, or they look like this. So I need to not only make some better art for them, but also decide what they are in the first place. I want the items in my game to reference magical weapons, artifacts, and stories from throughout mythologies. And I also think that these items give me a good chance to reference mythologies that have less focus in the game than the most famous ones like Norse, Greek, and Chinese mythology. So one of the first new sprites that I made is for an item that simply increases attack speed, and the item is called a Stinking Nightshade, which is a plant that induces hallucinations and intoxications whenever ate. So it's theorized that Norse berserkers might have used this plant to induce themselves into a rage state. I finished off the day by starting work on a new enemy. It's a Japanese yokai called the Ipandatara, and it's a head with one leg that just jumps around. It'll be another basic enemy similar to the goblin, but it'll jump around instead of running. On day 77, I made another item sprite, and then I started on making a proper background for the first stage, Mount Olympus. In order to make this background, I just found a picture of the mountain range around Mount Olympus in real life, and then I traced it in a sprite, keeping it pretty simple. And on the next day, I finished up this background and added a bit of horizontal parallax to it in-game, which gives the background more depth as you move around. And on the next day, I continued to fine-tune this new background, adding some vertical parallax as well, and making sure that everything just feels nice. Then I decided to turn my focus onto the rest of the first stage, as all the wave rooms are pretty much just the same tile set with a couple of decorations right now, so I want to improve that. And I made some new decorations, including these new statues of the player and of the boss. By the way, this video is sponsored by Skillshare. Lately, I've been wanting to improve my skill with sound design, as proper uses of sound effects really adds a lot to any sort of game. And with Skillshare, it's been easy to find classes and learning paths that are designed to help me learn sound design. If you don't know what Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, design, freelancing, game development, and more. Skillshare can help you take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, or side hustles to the next level. And with Skillshare, you get access to countless classes as well as learning paths. And learning paths are curated sequential class collections which are designed to help you master a specific skill. If you're interested in game development, there are categories dedicated to 3D modeling and animation, game design and development, sound design, and learning game engines like Unity or Unreal Engine. And if you're also interested in the YouTube and devlog side of things, then there are also courses on video editing and social media content curation. And I've been personally exploring a course on YouTube success led by Marcus Brownlee. If you're interested in joining Skillshare, then use my link that's in the description. The first 500 people to use this link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so get started today. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now it's time to go back to development. On day 80, I figured it would be fun to add a bit more interactivity to the environment, so I'm going to make the new statues breakable. Breakable objects are pretty simple and pretty similar to the ones I made in my previous game Project Seaborn. Basically, whenever you hit an object that can be destroyed, it gets replaced with some rigid bodies of chunks of it, and then these chunks are thrown around with an explosion force and a force in the opposite direction of the player. Combine that with a few particles and it looks pretty nice. So on the next day, I started decorating the library. Currently, it looks like hot garbage, especially the horrible tile set, so I focused on that first, just replacing it with a nice, dark, and cozy wood tile set. And then I made a bunch of details, including some destructible book stacks, some pushable chairs, a hanging chandelier that makes light, some bookshelves, and some more background details. And I continued this on the next day, adding a proper background tile set, a fireplace, a table, and 2 paintings. These 2 paintings are crude pixel art recreations of The Birth of Venus by Botticelli and Takayashi the Witch and the Skeleton Spectre by ukiyo-e artist Utagawa Kuniyoshi. So now the library actually looks like a library, even if the rooms to the left and the right are currently useless, and the healing area looks dumb. It's a start. So now I'm going to spend a while bouncing this game. Balancing a roguelike is really hard, especially one with stacking items like mine, as there's a lot of randomness, and also I want the game to be chaotic, but not too chaotic. I want it to be hard, but not super punishing, and I want the game to allow for cool combinations of items, but I don't want to make it too easy to get these combos, and I don't want to make it too mindless that you just outscale every enemy and the game gets boring. It's a lot to balance, and I'm nowhere close to getting that, so I'm just going to focus on balancing the first 10 waves and boss fight for the game now, and I'll focus on the rest later. So I continued on with balancing the next day, trying to make a spreadsheet that helped balance enemy spawn rates and fixing bugs. And I continued into the next day where I kept balancing the amount of money that you get from enemies, trying to keep it from being super low at the beginning of the game, but also trying to keep it from just letting you buy everything at every shop by the end of the first wave. I also cleaned up the UI a bit. Hiding the inventory unless you hold control is it just kinda seems unnecessary and messy to always have your items out. And on day 85, I made a lot of sprites for items. I decided that the theme for all critical hit items will be sight. Its crit is generally supposed to represent a hit to a vital organ or a hole in the armor or whatever, and so you have to have a keen eye to spot that. So the basic crit increase item is an Eye of Argus, who is a shepherd in Greek mythology who had 100 eyes, at least until Hera killed him. And one of my favorite item designs that I made is Aphrodite's Protection, which is an item that increases your defense at low HP. It's a shield in the shape of a heart, and it references a story in Greek mythology where Aphrodite saves Paris, a Trojan goober, from being killed in battle because he's under her protection. So the item does a similar thing, helping you out whenever you're low on health. I made a bunch of other items as well, and though most of them only sort of reference the stories in the name and quip, I do want you to be able to find out about these stories in the game, so I'm going to eventually add an item database where I can show off the original stories of the items and other facts about them. And on the next day, I finally completed the sprites for every item I have in the game so far, so now I just need to add some more items. So I added a poison status effect item, and I've finally decided what I want poison status effects to do. It'll be another simple tick damage status effect like fire, but to set it apart, it isn't stackable, and if you reapply poison, it just resets its duration. Basically, poison is a very easy to apply status effect that applies consistent but low damage over time. On day 87, I fixed some bugs with the Ippon Datsura, and then I buffed every single enemy in the game. I want there to be slightly less enemies, but I want them to actually pose some danger to the player individually. I also fixed countless bugs with the boss fights, shops, and enemies, and then I added a couple of new items, including one of my favorite items in the game that I think creates a pretty interesting sort of build, the Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull is a reference to a torture device in Greek mythology, and basically it's an item that increases your damage to enemy for each unique status effects that you have on the enemy. This ends up creating a status effect build, where you work to constantly inflict status effects on enemies and then capitalize on them by dealing damage and getting buffed by this item. And this item also synergizes well with the new poison status effect, as that status effect is practically permanent if you keep hitting the enemy, making it much easier to get that status effect count up and get that damage up. This status effect build plays pretty similar to the normal game, it's just attacking enemies to get stacks on them. But I think I'll add some more interesting status effects in the future that require a bit more setup and skill to apply to enemies, to make this build more powerful and more skill based. And I spent the rest of the day doing more balance changes, trying to get those first 10 waves and boss fights to a state that it's fun and interesting to play. And on day 88, I decided that the stages need something cool. Right now, you kind of just run around a pretty empty area, and there's no unique obstacles or mechanics or anything, and that's kind of hard to make interesting levels for. So I added a grapple point. It's very simple. If you are in its radius, then you can press the interact button in order to get flung at its center, allowing you to fly across the stage. I can use this to make the Mount Olympus stages more vertical, as you use the grapple points to fling yourself up mountains and onto clouds, which should be fun. And I also continue to playtest and balance the game, mostly continuing to make it harder. On day 89, I decided to add some more sound effects to the game. It's really hard to find good sound effects, and I'll probably have to buy some more for the final game. But I have a decent amount to choose for right now just left over from couch combat. So I added sounds for things like completing a wave, buying an item, leveling up, and picking an upgrade, new landing sound effects, and more. And with just a bunch of these small changes, the game now feels a lot more tactile. These sounds really add a lot to the game for such a small amount of effort. And on day 90, I started work on some new cloud style sets, and then I decided to make the rest of the items that I had planned for the 100 days mark. I want 25 items in total, and I currently have 20. So I added an item for increasing your max combo, which helps you get more money, an item that decreases the length of incoming debuffs, a cool movement item that allows you to dash in 8 directions like Celeste, and a new godly item, which is also a dash item. And basically the idea for this item is that every few seconds you can perform a cool dash, where you go through enemies and bullets without taking damage. It should make it a lot easier to dodge enemies if you have this item. But for that final 25th item, I decided that I'd make it something big, but I didn't have time for it today. So on day 91, I made more item sprites, then added a new stone tile set that I'll mix in with the grass one to make it look a bit more interesting. Plus I made 2 breakable Greek pots that will drop a bit of gold whenever destroyed. And on the next day, I continued to mess with values, buffing enemy level up speed so they are a bit more tanky, and less likely to get decimated by area of effect items. I need to eventually introduce more higher difficulty and HP enemies, and also probably some form of elites for enemies in order to keep the player from tearing through them as the game goes on. It's just adding more and more enemies doesn't really make the game that much harder. In general, I made a bunch of changes to try to make enemies more active and make their attacks harder to avoid. On day 93, I decided that I should go ahead and get full controller support into the game. So I started getting menus to function with controllers, and while I made some progress, I'm already running into bugs where whenever you have the pause menu open over another menu, then it controls both the menus at once. So I'm going to need to put quite a bit of time into it. And on day 94, I just did some work with stage details, including making the grapple points less horrendously ugly. And on day 95, I finally redid the first stage of the game, adding more decorations, a grapple point, and some clouds. It's more vertical to explore and more interesting looking. And now it's finally time to make the 25th item. I want it to be a special one, so I'm going to make it the second familiar in the game. It's a sword from Norse mythology which fights on its own. Freyr's sword. It attacks by locking onto an enemy and then by stabbing back and forth. And so on day 96, I did a bunch of work on the sword, giving it deal damage and bouncing it a bit. And on the next day, I got its level up animations and upgrades in place. It'll get faster with the first stack, but with the second one, it'll gain a new ability. Every 10 stab attacks, it'll do an area of effect spin attack, dealing heavy damage to enemies around it. This took a lot of work to get working right, but it's in the game now. And other than that, I made a basic written tutorial and controls guide in the main menu. I eventually want to make a more proper tutorial for the game, but this will work for now. And I also started overhauling the settings menu. I hate working with sliders and menus as they're messy and just don't work well with controllers. So I took the slider I had out, and now I have a settings menu with multiple tabs instead, which is way easier for me and also way easier to navigate. I went in and explicitly programmed all the transitions between different buttons whenever moving around with controller, just to make sure that there are no weird edge cases or bugs. So now this new settings menu is completely navigable with a controller, and it also fixed all the other bugs with navigating with a controller. So now you can control every single menu and do everything in the game with just a controller. And on day 98, I finally got to actually making a presence for the game on Steam. And in order to do this, I have to make a lot of art assets for the game page, so I cranked them out. Designing a logo, which I'm okay with. It's not beautiful, but it's not terrible, and putting together a bunch of different assets. They're all pretty simple, and I'll eventually replace it as I get more in the game, and maybe even make some unique art for it. And I finished up by getting a bunch of screenshots for the page as well. Plus, I had to fill out all the background details and stats, and also things like the description for the game. And then I submitted the Steam page, so it should hopefully be up by the time this video is out. So be sure to check it out and wishlist the game if you want to. And on day 99, I continued to polish the menus, fixing a few remaining bugs, and then adding some nice sound effects and popping animations for selecting and pressing buttons in the game. I also added a new section to the settings menu, gameplay settings. And the first option I put here was the option to disable screen shake, as I know some people don't like having that. I then used a cool open source GitHub project in order to automatically make button prompts in my game switch between Xbox, PlayStation, and mouse and keyboard prompts. This was super easy to implement, and it is something that my last game, Couch Combat, never even had, so it is really nice to have it in this game. I love open source projects like this, as it's just so convenient to be able to slot in all these useful tools and save some time and make my game better. And I finished up day 99 by redecorating and redesigning all the stages in the game with the new assets and objects. I want to add some more rooms in the future, but at least the ones I have right now are now pretty cool. And finally, day 100. I finished up by completing all the item sprays for the 25 items in the game, and then polishing up some of the things I missed. Redoing the Ipadatsura sprite to look better. It's still kinda weird. Fixing bugs with the Ares boss and the Daitsungu with attacking and bouncing the game a bit, plus finally exporting a build of the game. So the game is actually in a pretty good state right now. It is what I would say if it was. Don't get me wrong, it looks prettier and plays a lot nicer, but it is incredibly unbalanced. About half the items in the game just entirely break it if you stack a few of them. And almost every enemy is trivialized if you just get a few protection items. Plus, most player upgrades are overtuned as well. So I'm going to make some serious balancing changes, but after that, I'm going to start doing some closed demos of the game with friends and people on my Discord. I'm not going to be giving it out to everyone, I just want to send it to people who will record their gameplay and actually leave good feedback. But if you're interested and willing to do that, then you can join my Discord with the link in the description. And after I get this first part of the game balanced decently well, it'll be time to move on to the second stage, which will be set on a fleet of Viking ships and focused on Norse mythology. Other than that, be sure to check out the brand new Steam page and wishlist the game, as wishlisting really helps me get a bit of traction in the Steam algorithm, and it's the best way that you can support the game's development. Also, thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Be sure to use the link in my description for a 1-month free trial for the first 500 people to use the link. Thanks for watching. Bye.